Yes. I'm also allowing people from back home to contribute if they have any questions, although it's too early in the morning. Okay, now we are ready. Good morning and welcome all. I'm sorry for messing around with the technology. It is with pleasure, and we are really honored to have Professor Saunders from Melbourne University Law School, who today will share with us some ideas, and we have a lot of questions for her from Melbourne as well as from the Somali community around the world. And the topic is really about federalism, but we won't exclusively talk about federalism. I know there are a lot of things happening in the region, not only in Somalia, but the whole Horn of Africa. But before I do that, I just want to introduce, and it will take me all day to go through Cheryl Saunders' credentials, but I would rather leave this URL and for people to read later on their own leisure time. But first thing I want to say is I want to thank Dr. Cheryl Saunders for her contribution to the Somali intellectual discussions, the Somali Constitution. We had a few seminars at Melbourne that she helped us to think and reflect on the Constitution and a few other issues. But I'm just very quickly scrolling through this, mainly because if I read this, we'll be here until tomorrow. So I won't read, but I will leave the URL there for you to read, but I'll stop there because really the time today is to listen to Professor Saunders. So without further ado, I want to welcome you. Welcome to the Somali community in Melbourne and around the world. And really the topic we want to discuss today is about federalism. But the first few minutes, let me just give you the floor and you can tell us what you want, but we have a long list of questions after that. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, that sounds very ominous. But thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Mohammed, for that generous welcome. When Mohammed originally approached me, he asked me to talk today about aspects of federalism in Somalia. And rather than giving a general talk on federalism, which I'm sure you've heard a million times before, I asked that the group identify questions on which you'd like me to focus. And three very interesting questions were sent to me by Mohammed, although I gather you have many more. And I'm going to deal with those questions in the bulk of what I have to say today. But before I do that, I want to make some very brief observations about federalism, just to make sure that we're all roughly on the same page in order to frame the discussion. And so from time to time, I'll try to share my screen with you to focus in either on the questions themselves or on the points I want to make at the outset about federalism. And just before I move to those slides, can I just make two other points? One, you know more about Somalia than I do. I can bring you understanding of the way in which federalism and systems of multi-level government work generally and around the world. But the real value of this sort of meeting is for you to bring your own deep knowledge of Somalia and me to bring whatever I know about federalism, and for us to put those two things together. The other point is this. My present plan is just to go through this material, answer these three questions, and then to open up for questions at the end. But if you want to ask questions as we go, or wanted me to pause at any point, I'm really happy to do that. Mohammed, I'm in your hands. It's up to you to stop me if you think that would be a useful thing to do. So let's open up by just thinking about, and I've only got a couple of very short slides on this. Thinking about federalism, and apologies for doing this to you because I know you've thought a lot about it yourselves, but let's just get the very basics on the table. Now, this slide, there's only two of them. This slide deals with the essentials in the design of federalism. If you're putting together a federal scheme, what are you almost certainly going to find? And this, the opening proposition here, well, you might find all sorts of things, because the reality is that the 25 or so federations that exist around the world take a wide variety of forms, but they do share some very basic features, and they're the ones on this slide. First, there must be at least 2 levels of government, each with some autonomy in its own right. So there may be variations on that, but there must be at least 2. Second point, public power must be divided between them. And with power comes money, obviously. Thirdly, and this is only a usually, not a must, there is usually some representation of the constituent parts of the federation, whatever they're called, states, regions, cantons, blah, blah, blah. There's usually some representation of those constituent units in one or more of the central institutions, typically a second chamber of the legislature, but that can be in other institutions as well. And the purpose of that, partly symbolic, but partly also to inform central decision-making so that it's properly informed by conditions around the country. And the fourth necessary point of federal design, these arrangements are protected to some degree in a constitution. Now, this is federalism. It's a very distinctive approach to organizing a state, and it's sometimes described with all sorts of slogans, 2 of which are on the screen here. 1, federalism represents unity in diversity. You can turn that around if you like, diversity in unity. But either way, federalism clearly has those 2 components. And the second very familiar saying, federalism involves self-rule on the part of the constituent units and shared rule through central institutions. Now, as I said earlier, there's plenty of variations on all that, but those are the critical components of the design of federalism. Now, my second slide deals with the operation of federalism. This is at least as important. You know, I've sometimes looked at federations that have been designed or sought to be designed in countries around the world where it's almost, federalism is almost treated as a slogan or a symbol. As long as we have a formal federation, well, everything's all right. So we saw that in Nepal, where everybody fought for federalism, but it's not operating very well in practice. In a sense, we've seen it in Somalia. We've seen it in South Sudan. The point I want to get across on this slide is federalism is a working system of government. That's the only point of having it, is if it works. It's not a slogan and it's not a symbol. So that means a number of things. It means that each level of government needs institutions, and they need to be effective institutions. Each level of government must have at least an executive government and a legislature. And each level of government also needs access to courts and a public service. Very often in federations, United States is an example, each level of government has its own courts and its own public service, but there are other federations where these things are shared between the levels of government in some appropriate way. And Nigeria is an example, but there are others. India is another. Next point, each level of government in a federation is accountable to its people for the exercise of its responsibilities. The people of the central level of government are the people in the country as a whole, and the central level of government is accountable to all of them. The people of the constituent units are the people in its territorial area. And each constituent unit is accountable to its people for the exercise of its responsibilities. Second last point, Each level of government needs to be capable of exercising the powers allocated to us by the Constitution. Now, that's partly a guideline to which powers you should give to which level, but it's also got an additional point there. It's not just a matter of allocating the powers. You need to think about whether they can actually be exercised by each level of government. And if the answer is no, or we're not sure, then something needs to be done about that, either by shifting the powers around or by really effective capacity building. And the final point on the slide, governments sometimes may need to collaborate across the levels of government, collaborate in the public interest. I mean, one classic example of that has been during the COVID pandemic. Neither level of government in any federation has been able to deal with that itself. All of them, where it's been handled most effectively, it's been done in a way in which the contribution that each level of government can make has been recognised and valued, but when they need to get together to agree on stuff, they've done that effectively. So that's all I want to say about federalism, and we can come back to any of those points later. But the really important question is how do they, what application do they have? How can they be made effective in Somalia if Somalia intends to proceed with federalism? And that then takes us to our first question. So this is the first question. And this is not my question, it was put to me by the group. Can federalism work in a country like Somalia, and I've put Ethiopia in brackets, where tribal alliances is more important than tribal allegiance is more important than elected representatives? Now I'm going to stop sharing and now just talk until we get to the next question. Now, in this question, Ethiopia was in the question as it was put to me, but I want to put Ethiopia aside because we get to it in the second question anyway. And let's just focus on Somalia. Can federalism work in a country like Somalia if tribal allegiance is more important than elected representatives? Now, I think that's more than a question about federalism. That's essentially a question about the challenges of operating a modern state in a country like Somalia. If it's right that tribal allegiance is more important than elected representatives. Federalism is just a means of organising the state. The underlying issue here is statehood itself. Now, and I say that because in principle, the idea of a modern state is that every state requires all its people to be treated and protected equally as citizens of the state. I mean, that's one of the core ideas of statehood. And the corollary of that is that citizens have allegiance to the state. Now, where a state is a democracy, of course, the institutions of the state draw their legitimacy from elected representatives, and that's the assumption in the question. But even where a state is not a democracy, even where there are no elected representatives or the elections are a bit of a fiddle, it's still true that a functioning state, a state that can actually work to do the things it's supposed to do, critically depends on that citizen-state relationship. So I think, and this is the thing for us to talk about, the real challenge in a country like Somalia is to work out a way to adapt to the demands of modern statehood that is feasible, can work in Somalia, in other words, and is meaningful to its people. So it's not a question of abandoning traditional ways or abandoning the state. It's a question of how do you bring these two things together so that they can coalesce effectively in the interests of the people in the conditions of the 21st century. Now, it's a big ask, and it sounds like a big ask, but plenty of other countries have done it in the past, more or less successfully. I mean, if we look at the period of time since the beginning of the 20th century, if you like, Japan did it, India did it, Papua New Guinea did it, Kenya is in the process of doing it. that the modern statehood is not a natural phenomenon in most parts of the world. And most parts of the world have adapted their institutions to it with varying degrees of success. Now, I'm not underestimating the difficulties of doing that in Somalia and elsewhere, but the challenge is inescapable because the world presently works on the basis that all people are organized in states. It just isn't possible to opt out completely of the international state system. So I think that's the underlying issue that requires critical attention in Somalia itself. And hopefully we can come back to that. So now let me turn to the question actually asked. And so I'm still on question 1. Can federalism as a form of organizing the state work in a country like Somalia? Now, that question demands another one in response. So let me throw it back to you and we'll get to it in question time. What do you think is the alternative to federalism, given what I've already said about states? Now, in the context of a country like Somalia, 2 answers are theoretically possible. And this takes us back to the idea of federalism as being unity and diversity. If you don't have federalism in a country like Somalia, you have one of 2 options: unity or complete diversity. The alternative to federalism in Somalia is either the division of the country into a number of separate independent states, drawing on the example of Somaliland, or it's a single centralized unitary state. Now, there are obvious practical difficulties with each of those options, and I won't bore you by going through them, but we can talk about them later. But in any event, even leaving the practical difficulties aside, either of those alternatives requires either Somalia as a whole or what presently are the component parts of Somalia to operate as a modern state. And that takes us right back to the problem of statehood that we were discussing before. Now, of course, the tribal relationships to which the question refers raises some particular issues that need attention in considering the design of a federation. One is the need to find a basis on which different parts of the country, different tribal groupings, if you like, will work together in a federation. And that involves consideration both of the division of power between the centre and the constituent units and the design of central institutions. And I know that both of those things have been a big issue in Somalia. Another issue that needs attention if you're going to design a federation, working federation in Somalia, is to ensure that the constituent units or the states of a Somali federation operate as polities serving all Somali citizens that are within their borders. And this is the old familiar challenge of so-called ethnic federalism. It's tempting, and in many ways it's logical, to use ethnicity or tribal allegiance as a criterion for defining the borders of constituent units because it offers the majority a sense of belonging. And that's very important in a federal context. But it's rare for that drawing of ethnic boundaries to be done so neatly that it doesn't disadvantage some other people of other ethnicities or mixed ethnicities. And that reality, that it's hard to do it in 2021, can be expected to be reinforced over time as the world changes, mobility becomes greater, we grapple with other problems, including climate change. So once again, it becomes necessary to understand this problem, but to agree to ways of handling it that are workable in the context of Somalia now and in the context of Somalia going forward. So that's all I want to say about the first question, but now let me take you just quickly to share screen to the second question, which is a little bit similar, and it's this. Given the crisis in the Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia and Ethiopia, where both governments have failed in the case of Somalia and Ethiopia, where the government's about to implode, can we conclude federalism did not and cannot work in this area? So that's the second question that was put to me. And to some extent, of course, we've already dealt with it through the discussion of statehood and the discussion of the alternatives to federalism. But I want to focus on those aspects of the question that refer to Ethiopia, because I think there are insights that might be useful for Somalia from past and present developments in Ethiopia. Now, of course, the current situation in Ethiopia seems absolutely disastrous, and the turn of events is so disappointing that I can completely understand that it presents a cause for despair. But again, despair isn't really an option, given the millions of people who are affected by these developments. So let's think about where to from here, maybe not taking on all the problems of Ethiopia at the moment, but at least considering their relevance to Somalia. So of course, the current problems in Ethiopia are about more than federalism and federal design. But I think they have some relevance also to what is going on there now. And let me make 3 points about it, which may be relevant to you. So the first point is this. Over the last 20 years or so, Ethiopian federalism has been very famous in federalism circles for at least 2 features. One was the use of ethnicity as the basis for drawing the boundaries of the states. And the second was the use of the second chamber of the central legislature, not for legislative purposes, but to deal with federal disputes rather than relying on a court with constitutional jurisdiction to sort out legal disputes and to interpret the Constitution in cases of ambiguity. I think it's now clear from recent events that neither of those unique features of Ethiopian federalism have worked. The ethnic boundaries were always a bit shonky, requiring at least some ethnicities to be jammed together in states and others to be constantly jockeying for new states. But I think it's also probably true to say that the ethnic boundaries inhibited the development of a willingness to work together with a common purpose for those purposes for which collective action is necessary. And the lack of a court to resolve disputes led to a very ambiguous constitution and left a vacuum that only politics and ultimately power, when politics fail, can fill. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. My second point about Ethiopia for your consideration is that the design and operation of the federal constitution was deficient in other ways. And now I say this with some confidence because I've recently had to look at it myself. I have an Ethiopian PhD student who I hope will arrive in Australia soon, although heaven knows with all the border problems. But that caused me, for the purposes of supervising his thesis, I went and read the Ethiopian Constitution. So it's more or less in my mind at the moment. And I was surprised at how very unclear it was about which level of government was supposed to do what in Ethiopia. Now, of course, in designing a federal constitution, perfect clarity in dividing power is never possible. It's impossible to predict all the contingencies that will arise, which you might need the constitution to resolve. But it is certainly possible to predict more than was done by the designers of the Constitution of Ethiopia, and to be much more clear about the responsibilities of the various levels of government. And my third point about Ethiopia is that it now seems that there are real, or that there have been real deficiencies in the implementation of federalism in Ethiopia in ways that ensured that each level of government worked effectively and that they could work together collaboratively when that was needed. I think the deficiencies in operational federalism have been papered over for decades by the dynamics of having a one-party state. It wasn't really the federation collaborating and working. It was the party doing it across jurisdictional boundaries. And as we see in Ethiopia, one-party states don't last forever. And when the government changed, the inability of the federation to operate properly was absolutely exposed, contributing to the current problems. So there are lessons in there for Somalia, I think, about design, but there's also very important lessons about operation in practice. Now, one last screen share for the last question, and then I'll stop talking. And that is this question. And we're back to Somalia now, and we're in the context of constitution making and not specifically federalism. And the question is, Somalia failed to find a way to get its constitution finalised, despite help from the UN and the EU and others. Are there any suggestions or ideas to help us take this step forward? What have other countries done to solve a problem like this? Is Somalia unique? Okay. Now, to answer the last bit of that question, no, Somalia is not unique. There is nothing unique in this world about making multiple attempts to finalise a constitution. Somalia's case may look pretty extreme at the moment, but it is certainly not unique. The real lesson from world experience is the need to keep trying, if that's what you want to do, if you're sufficiently committed, drawing on your own knowledge of the impediments that have occurred and accepting the need to find a compromise that works. We also know from world experience that most constitutions are imperfect at the outset. The imperfections may be in varying degrees, but no constitution has ever been written that is the perfect instrument from day one. Every constitution needs constant work over time. In the immediate aftermath of making a new constitution, very careful attention needs to be given to implementing it, probably for at least the first 5 years. And many constitutions continue to gather acceptance and legitimacy as a result of their operation over time. Think about the Japanese constitution, for example, which had almost no legitimacy at the time it was made, but gradually acquired legitimacy and has worked for its people. Think about the German constitution, same thing. At the end of the Second World War, but now one of the most admired constitutions in the world. But I want to give you just quickly, if I can, Mohammed, without taking up too much time, 2 quick examples of constitutions that failed the first time and failed the second time and required perseverance. And one is the case of Australia. Now, I give you Australia because so many of you live here, not because Somalia and Australia are so similar, but because the message is the same message. It took Australia 10 years to agree on a constitution that would federate the 6 colonies. They began at the beginning of the decade of the 1890s. They began with a conference. They brought political leaders together and they agreed to continue with the project. The next year, they came together in a constitutional convention with elected delegates, with delegates chosen from each of the colonial parliaments. So they were all political leaders, really, coming together in that first convention. They came up with a pretty good federal constitution. They all went back home. Nothing happened. Constitution never came into effect. They all had more things to do at home with their own local concerns. and the whole federation movement completely collapsed. And so the world went on for a couple, and Australia went on, and the colonies went on for a couple of years. And eventually in 1894, one political leader said, no, this is not good enough, let's have another go. He also convened a conference. He convened it in part of the country that was most inconvenienced by not having federation, on the borders between New South Wales and Victoria. And they said, well, what went wrong last time? What went wrong last time was all we had were political leaders. It's the people who want federalism. So let's come up with a plan that involves the people. So their plan was to say, let every colony pass an act that commits itself to electing delegates to a new constitutional convention. And once that constitutional convention comes up with a constitution, let's commit them to having a referendum in each of the colonies, asking the people whether they approve the constitution. And that more or less happened in 1897-98. But so the state of Victoria, where I am, and I assume Mohammed is at the moment, dutifully did all these things. It had an elected election for its delegates to the convention, and they pulled their weight, and it had a referendum at the end, and the referendum passed. Victoria was its usual virtuous self, but the rest of the country was much less obedient. Queensland refused to participate at all. Western Australia refused to have elected delegates. So the other colonies said, oh, well, okay, we'll have your unelected delegates then, compromise. So only 5 of them were participating, no Queensland. They came up with a constitution. Okay, they said, now the deal is that it goes to referendum. No, says Western Australia, we're not prepared to do that. New South Wales fiddled with the majority required in New South Wales to make it higher than an ordinary majority, so that when the constitution went to referendum, it was rejected in New South Wales, passed in Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania, rejected in New South Wales. Again, another sort of fail. So what did they do? After all, here they have this precious constitution drawn up by an elected convention. They negotiated with New South Wales, and they made enough changes to the draft to get New South Wales to say, okay, we'll have another referendum. Queensland rejoined, and they made a few changes to keep Queensland happy. The constitution went to referendum in those 5 states, with Western Australia still being sulky, and was passed. And so those 5 states all said, okay, let's go ahead. Western Australia can come if it wants. And just before the constitution was due to come into effect, Western Australia had a referendum too, and it was passed. So that's a long story. And for those of you who are not in Australia, I apologise for the detail. But I wanted to tell you the story just to show you that what the idea of failure, compromise, something less than perfect is the norm. It happens everywhere. But you need to understand your own patch in order to overcome those difficulties. Now, the second case, and I won't go through it in the same sort of detail, is Kenya. I mean, you've seen it much closer to home in Somalian terms, but you've seen the same sort of thing in Kenya. An attempt at a constitution against a background of violence and mistrust, lots of work going into it, lots of division about it. Constitution eventually fails, more violence in Kenya's case. And then that very clever, I think, compromise of getting that committee of experts together and saying to it, you take all the different drafts and come up with a compromise version that looks as if it'll work in Kenya and will keep everybody happy. And hopefully we'll trust this group of experts, but anyway, in the end, it'll have to be accepted by the Kenyan Parliament and accepted by the Kenyan. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, it's still a work in progress in Kenya. We can see that with some of the cases. that are currently going through the Kenyan courts. But definite progress is being made. And I think Kenya is actually a better example for Somalia at the moment than Ethiopia is. Now, I'm just going to finish in just a moment, but let me just say this. The question that was put to me also raises an issue about external assistance to constitution making. And I think it's worth tackling that directly. Of course, external assistance is very useful for a whole range of purposes. I guess that's what I'm doing here now. But the responsibility for finalizing a Somali constitution needs to be borne by Somali leaders and the Somali people who have intimate knowledge of their own patch and will have to live and work with the constitution over time. And to the extent that external assistance detracts from local responsibility, it does constitution making a disservice. Now, this is borne out by the UN's own documentation on constitution making. The UN's documentation refers to a constitution, or to the making of a constitution, as a sovereign process for which national ownership and national leadership is critical. Now, it may be that sometimes both domestic and international actors lose sight of this, but it is essential nevertheless. You might note that there's some ambiguity about the meaning of that term, national ownership. What does it mean to say that national ownership is important in the context of making a constitution? Well, it might mean two things. National ownership might be contrasted with international ownership. In the present context, this means that Somalia as a country needs a sense of ownership of the constitution, which may not be achieved if external actors exert too much influence, making it internationally owned rather than nationally owned. But the other possible additional meanings of national ownership might mean that the constitutional process and the constitution that results from it needs to be owned by the country as a whole and not just by the political leaders or the tribal leaders. Now, understood in that way, the idea of national ownership calls for a more inclusive process involving people throughout the country and regions throughout the country. And given the nature of the Constitution as a country's fundamental law, that more broad-based notion of ownership also makes sense. So the question for you is this on this point. If national ownership of a constitution in the broader sense is required, what would that look like in Somalia? Forget the international community for a moment. What would national ownership of the new constitution, of a process to get a new constitution, look like in Somalia? What kind of inclusion is necessary and possible? Should the process be bottom-up or top-down or some mixture of the two? Would it be a multi-stage process involving initial agreement on basic principles on which the final constitution is built, as was done so successfully, actually, in South Africa? Would it be possible to use the constitutional instruments that have already been agreed and to adapt them using some sort of Kenyan type approach? Or would it be useful at this point to start again, drawing up a constitution from scratch, understanding that no constitution is ever drawn up completely from scratch, because there's always a sense of rollover of institutions with which you're familiar. So that's enough from me. Over to you for questions and comments and critically, ideas about how to move forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was amazing. I think it's more than we expected and very educational. I hope with your permission, we can share this video on the social media and other websites. So thanks for that, also giving us that permission. I have a lot of questions, but I'm always fair. I will allow other people first.
Very inclusive.
Yeah, so I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, but we also have to be mindful that we really only have 10 to 15 minutes of Saunders' time. So we don't want keep it away from this beautiful sunny day out there. So over to you. Any questions? Jabir in the States, your hand is up. You're in a democratic country. You're in America. Why are you? Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I say hi to everybody in the panel. Australians are known to be real activists. I wish we could transform that back to states. And I have one question regarding the Constitution, and I can see the headache. I've been there from the beginning up to now. I've been on the ground in Somalia. I know the headache we're having with this Constitution. My question is, there are variety, different kind of constitutions that are out there that you mentioned. In Somalia, for a country that's a post-conflict, is there any specific kind of federal constitution that can be recommended for a state like Somalia? Or it is a problem of implementation? Can we say, okay, this kind of federalism is good for post-conflict country? Or are they all the same? It's a matter of implementation. That's my question.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are plenty of federations in post-conflict countries. Federation is often recommended for post-conflict countries, but they're all different. I mean, there is no magic federal constitution for a post-conflict country. It really needs to respond to Somalia's own circumstances. One thing I would say, I mean, it's obviously tempting in a post-conflict context where the conflict has been ethnic-based or pitted different ethnicities that are territorially organized against each other. It's very tempting to construct the federation on ethnic lines on the basis that I described before. And maybe that's what's possible, all that's possible at the outset. But just look to the future as well. Understand that if there are minorities within the state, within an otherwise ethnically focused state, they need to be catered for, and understand that ethnicities will and probably should to some degree break down over time. And the Constitution needs to allow for that sort of flexibility. I think there's been so much experience with federalism in post-conflict states now that you could look forward and see the sorts of issues that arise in the course of implementation over time and seek to provide for them.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Brahan, please go ahead. Mr. Brahan.
Thank you, Mohammed. And welcome, Charles. This is a great talk and time to deal with this. Now, look, forgive me if I'm not in law, I'm a scientist, and I will ask questions. Developing the law, I mean, it includes culture, way of living, and many other organic to the areas or to the people. One of the problems of Africa, the way I see, has had a history of a colonial moving, not organically, be it Somalia, be it any country in Africa, has not had the chance of organically developing those village chiefs into a process of coming, and that was history of Africa, that all of them were working together in some sort of give and take. The Constitution, I mean, it is great as, you know, most African countries have the best Constitution, but it's all in the shelf. And that tells me one thing. The people are not in concurrent with the Constitution. We're giving them something to apply, but then they're not in it. They're far from it. Okay? Now, I see that dilemma, and developing Constitution is knowledge. But if those people were given the knowledge to develop this sort of organically coming into the system, may have helped it. Because the current crisis of Ethiopia, and you know, I come from that region, and I see it everywhere. In fact, Sudan is going through even worse process of this. Sudan was the largest country in the region, in Africa as a basket for Africa. And it is now disintegrating. The South Sudan is gone, possibly next Darfur and name and whatever. The same Ethiopia now is heading. I think the people in Addis Ababa or in Khartoum or in Mogadishu or in my own country, Eritrea, Asmara, are having those constitutions to just tell the world not to lead the people. So how do we link the people and the constitution? Not only the parliaments or the elites, just the running ones. So I think the missing ingredient here is the constitution are not organically brought into the life of the people. So how do you see that journey? And I'm sure it's $1 million question. How do you see that can happen in those people feeling that they can use what they know to make their own journey in peace? Thank you.
Bernard, that is an absolutely great question. And it's the $64,000 question in the world at the moment. It's not purely a Somalian question. It's a question for most, I would say most of the countries of the world. I'm presently doing some work in Papua New Guinea where it's an issue. I was speaking to Pacific Island parliamentarians last week where it's an issue. You're quite right. Just as I said earlier, that a state is a sort of an introduced concept into much of the world, so is the Constitution, the idea of a written Constitution. And in many countries, it sits pretty lightly on the surface of the country, while cultural practices and cultural laws and customary laws are the real things that matter and are familiar in people's lives. So, so a couple of points, I guess. One, you're right that a constitution is much more likely to be successful, sort of naturally successful, if it's had the opportunity to develop organically over centuries. Even that, might I say, is not a guarantee for perfection, if you look at the situation in the United Kingdom at the moment, but of course that's what you say is right. But no country has that luxury at the moment. Secondly, I think it is important not to assume that there are just some standard constitutional forms that have been agreed and can be dumped in any country and labelled best practice. In the first place, those forms are not working so greatly everywhere anyway. But in the second place, we somehow have to work out how culture and customary ways can marry with those familiar constitutional type of institutions. Now, in a sense, multi-level government is one way of doing that. I mean, I said at the outset that a federal system has at least 2 levels of government. The reality is that mostly they have 3 and sometimes more. And the local level of government is the one that people are familiar with. So if we think of this problem from the bottom up, you know, how can we make constitutional government relevant? How can we bring these 2 bits of national life together? It must be possible to design local level government in a way that really meets people's understandings and expectations. It must be possible. And if that's right, then the next level up should be somehow designed so as to work in with that and at least complement. And then you can go up to the central level where, you know, it may well be that what they're doing nationally is not all that relevant to people in the villages. But who cares, really, because they're doing things that should be the types of things that can only be done at the national level. You know, dealing with buying vaccines or getting vaccines in or negotiating climate change agreements. And then with the central level being informed by conditions lower down, but then doing things that require national level action. So I think there's just room for a huge amount more creativity than we have shown so far in dealing with the very important question you raised. But it's going to have to be done, I think.
If Mohammed would allow me just one comment. If Mohammed can allow me one.
Sure. Yeah, and then we have one more question from Zara, but I think we'll stop with that. After that, I think we'll ask people to write the questions and we'll send to you, and perhaps we can do it that way, because I'm a bit concerned that we're getting close to 1 hour. Okay, go ahead.
And one day, Mohammed, we might have a special session on how to deal with just this sort of question that Dr. Ahmed was talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so Burhan, go ahead, and then Zahra after.
Now, well, look, we've been tested here in Australia with our federation and the federal government versus state, and the federal boundaries have been gone from the federal to the states and states to whatever. Now, that's one simple example. But what I'm trying to look at that is when I see one side of the world with that sort of problem taking a gun, whereas the other here we don't see the gun taking place. And my question as a scientist is why? Why these people deal with it and these people cannot deal with it? So my simple way of looking to that is people in the other side, they look that they lost all power and they're trying to reclaim their sort of share of that power. Whereas here, I'm trying to reflect the culture here. Nothing more than anything but the culture. Even in UK, even the Brits exit or whatever, in those processes, you see as a process moving peacefully, whereas in the African Union or in the Ethiopian context or Sudan or Somalia or whatever, in those contexts, you don't see that culture permeates into the system. Now, isn't that something that comes as the elephant in the room in a very, just say, very elementary way of looking to the two pictures and giving some assessment? And within that, call it for itself or beg something to say, well, these people, frustration speaks to something that need to be looked at separately. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you're quite right that the two cultures are radically different, and they're radically different for historical reasons. That's absolutely right. But the question is how to take what's positive out of culture and manage the other. I mean, the impacts of colonialism are still alive across the world. But it's also a reality. And we can't get in a time machine and wind it back. Yes. So what is the answer going forward is the question.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we'll let Zahra ask. Zahra is standing or running, whatever the correct word is, for a seat in Parliament. So
great.
you might have a chance to say something in the Parliament if you win, and we hope you win. But Zahra, over to you. It's your turn. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mohammed. Nice to meet you so individually.
Lovely to meet you too, and good luck.
Well, thank you. The first migrant Muslim African woman running for federal seat, and it's interesting, but I'm enjoying. My question is that we have seen federalism in Australia, that the federal government have no power of implementing anything when it comes to the pandemic, and the state have responsibility. And we've seen how fragile it is. Then why do we think it will work other countries that got completely different culture and religion and clan system? That's one question. My other question is, there's a lot of Western interference into a lot of the countries trying to build a democracy, and going to war to say to them, oh, they need a democracy, we need to free the women and all this, and which we know is the intention. That's not, in the end, it's economical. So if it's not locally born, locally owned, it will never gonna make a difference. Why are we still pushing that agenda, or you need a constitution? And similar what happened to Australia when the British colony arrived. So they just bought their British law in a suitcase and said, this is what it is, and classified people. Are we doing the same thing to these other, African and other countries, taking Western way of governing and constitution and saying, oh, this is going to work for you? Is it the time we need to let other countries, everyone run their own way, and we need to focus our own?
Okay, interesting question. So let me deal with the first one. It's absolutely not the case that the federal government has no power. And I happen to think that the Australian federal system worked extremely well during the pandemic. What we saw, what we have seen and we continue to see is the two levels of government, admittedly sometimes acrimoniously, pooling their power. The Commonwealth has more economic muscle. Only the Commonwealth could procure vaccines from overseas. The Australian medical institutions that approve new vaccines and new medicines are all based at the national level. All of those, and the Commonwealth has a substantial quarantine power exercised through the Biosecurity Act, even though they chose not to establish quarantine institutions themselves. But very importantly, the level of government that is closer to the people, significantly closer to the people, had responsibility for health and all the associated policy decisions that go along with concerns about public health in a pandemic. And that has been also critical in at least two ways. One, the public health situation has differed dramatically around the country. You can see in the two most populous states of New South Wales and Victoria, the pandemic problems have been much more serious than in, say, Tasmania or Western Australia. It would make absolutely no sense for those states to have been subject to the same rules as Victoria and New South Wales. And each state has also got sort of different vulnerabilities. Some have a larger concentration of old people than others. Some have larger concentrations of vulnerable Indigenous people than others. Some have more ethnically mixed populations with different demands to get messages across. There have been all sorts of ways in which the state system has worked very well. And the other thing is that I think what's been fascinating over the last couple of years is you can see how federalism's worked as a check and balance. Whereas in the UK, you could see every now and again sort of the UK government rushing like a bull into a policy position. Now we're locked down, now we're not. Here, economic considerations and health considerations, both of which are on the track during the pandemic, have been balanced through multi-level government. And I think that's led to the relatively good outcomes. It's been a very stressful 2 years, but if you compare it with developments elsewhere, relatively good outcomes in Australia. It's not over yet though, so keep watching this space.
Yeah.
On your second point, I mean, that's a very important point as well. Of course it's different, and we justify it as being different. Expecting all states to take on board standards in the International Bill of Rights is not the same as expecting all states to take on board important colonial law. And we justified by saying that the International Bill of Rights is globally owned. It was originally put together by pretty representative bodies, and it continues to be maintained by pretty representative bodies. Moreover, there are plenty of leaders in many places, including, for example, Myanmar before the coup, who would say they are not just Western ideas. These are ideas that all healthy communities have to some degree or other. However, you're right that the way in which do-gooding externals come in and give you the gospel is annoying, and very often does not make adequate allowance for local ownership. This has been handled better in some places than others. I mean, in places like Tunisia, where admittedly there's now a problem, that whole question of what do you do about women's rights in a country that culturally has not recognized women's rights, and how do you bring those two together, was carefully negotiated in those countries as a sort of a staging post. And I think that same process needs to occur everywhere. Some sort of process of negotiation and trying to come up with a version of the international human rights standards that fit local conditions and are workable in local conditions.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was quite comprehensive, and I'm sorry, but we really have to wind down. But perhaps I will allow another 2 or 3 minutes if there's a few last words from anyone or from Professor Saunders yourself. But after that, I think we'll stop it there, because I'm very concerned. It's such a beautiful day. And if you excuse me, I have a boss who is knocking at the door. I have a cat that if I don't let, she will break the door. So,
well, you're very lucky you haven't heard from my dog. That's all I can say.
Yes, but yeah, and then I just noticed such a beautiful day. It's actually a divine day out there.
It's really gorgeous. I advise all of you who are in Melbourne should get out there.
Yeah,
Mohammed,
we'll wind down the last couple of minutes. Yeah.
Going forward, do you mind if I comment?
Yeah, please. We're winding down. Okay, please.
So, now given what we're talking and what we're asking, I see the best way is how to help people get educated. We need to create a fertile ground before the constitutions are imported. And those will only need some scholarships or some means of supporting, creating grounds for what we want to happen. Imposing it without background, I think it is, destined to fail. So the way I see Melbourne University, in fact, I'm a staff for, honorary now at Melbourne University, and I have been a staff for many years. I have been arguing about connecting with Africa, connecting that opportunity. Africa is the youngest continent where there is a lot of young people who are hungry for knowledge. And this will be potentially for tomorrow. So look into that. I think it will be helpful. If we want to influence the future, we need to influence the people and the future generations by education, by providing opportunity. Thank you.
Sure. Can I also just say, though, that rather than, I agree with you about education, but rather than sort of talking in the abstract, as in many ways we've been doing here today, it's very helpful to turn them into problems. So, rather than saying, let's divide power between the levels of government, to say, how would you deal with the COVID vaccination program? How do you think that should happen? Who should be doing what? How should you be encouraging people at the village level to be vaccinated? And how should we be actually getting the vaccines there, and who should actually do it? As soon as you start actually thinking about some of these arrangements work in the real world as you know it, then it all starts becoming clearer about what the advantages of certain approaches are, or what the disadvantages of certain approaches are.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. I just noticed Peter Lang, who was very patiently waiting all the way from Sydney. Peter, do you still have a question or comment, or you have the last word?
I do have a question if we have time, but I was going to give let the Somalis ask their questions first. But if we have a couple of minutes, I'd like to ask one. If that's okay.
Please go ahead. Okay.
The weather's horrible here in Sydney, so I have all day. But I understand you're all desperate to get out into the beautiful Melbourne weather. And thank you very much for that extremely interesting presentation, Chow. My question is, you mentioned how no constitution is perfect from the outset, obviously, and you gave some examples of how the final version of constitutions has been struggled over until it finally came about. And I was wondering, is it a good idea or not to be bold and enact a constitution, even if knowing full well that there may still be even pretty fundamental issues in it that are not fully agreed on, but go ahead and enact it and then be prepared to make amendments to it later. And I'm thinking of the example of the US there, where I read a little bit about that recently, because they have, I don't know how many, but a lot of amendments to their constitution that we hear a lot about in the news all the time. Probably the first, the second, and the fifth is probably the ones we hear the most about, but there are many others. And what I read was that document was so controversial in the beginning when they first drafted it that these many amendments became necessary. And I was just wondering how, if you can enlighten us, how did they do that? Because obviously the barrier to change a constitution is set very high for good reasons, obviously. But did they initially have a lower level, a lower barrier to making these amendments to make that possible? Because it seems very difficult now to make changes to the constitution in the US and elsewhere. How did they do that at the time when they brought in all those amendments?
Well, one point, so 3 points about this. One, it's not desirable to make a constitution impossible to change. There is obviously an art in making it possible, but not too easy to change. Somehow you need to strike some sort of happy balance between those two. And that's quite hard very often in a federal country where you probably want some element of federal of agreement of the constituent units to change. But constitutions ideally need to be changed over time. And if they're not going to be changed over time, then either the courts will have to be very creative in interpreting the Constitution, as has happened in the United States, or the Constitution will just become irrelevant. So you can see plenty of constitutions around the world that are amended when necessities arise, South Africa, Germany, etc. Secondly, the United States is a complicated story with constitutional change, and probably not a role model on this front. The first 10 amendments were made almost immediately after the Constitution came into effect, as a result of really effectively an agreement that would happen. And they're the amendments that you hear about all the time. They're on all the cop shows and etc. The next tranche of amendments, or most of them, were made following the Civil War. And they were effectively forced by the outcome of the Civil War. And then the others have been dribs and drabs over time and not so exciting. So I don't think you can draw a lot of insight from the US experience. However, there is a body of, wouldn't put it quite as learning, but there is a discussion that goes on in constitution-making circles, asking exactly the question you asked, Peter. Should you just, if you can't agree on stuff, should you just leave it and assume that you can fix it later? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what it is. Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. If you can't agree on something now, that means that going forward, and everybody's prepared to go forward on that basis, that means that everybody thinks they're going to win eventually. So in a sense, you're perpetuating the argument. And the likelihood is, I think, that none of it will happen. So a really bad case study for this is Iraq, where the Constitution was made in very, very fraught circumstances as the American occupation ended. and a whole lot of things, including federalism and the establishment of an upper house, were left to be sorted out later, and really none of them have been. And Iraq is still a country in some sort of governance distress. So I'm not trying to detract from what I said earlier about no constitution being perfect, because that's absolutely right. But if there are institutions that really matter to you, then you should try and reach agreement. It's easier to come to some sort of compromise and put them in, even if that's a compromise, and think, let's see how this works, give them a fair go, and then amend them over time, than just saying, well, let's leave this gaping hole in our constitution and assume that at some stage in the future we can agree on it.
Yeah, thank you. You're muted, Mohammed.
You're muted, Mohammed.
I always joke about this. I think people can lip read me, but I'm sorry about that. I want to thank you, Cheryl Saunders. This was really very useful. And with your permission, as we said earlier, we will share with the rest of the community. And if there are any feedback, questions, comments, if you don't mind, I will forward them to you.
Sure.
But we won't stop you from this beautiful day, or even for the rest of the holiday period. I know you're always busy doing other work, but in the new year, I'll get back to you, and maybe we can continue all those useful seminars you used to help us to have at Melbourne Uni. So with that, I really want to thank you. And with your help, I think maybe we should do a virtual upload for
Thank you.
So
it's been lovely to meet you all. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you very much. We'll continue, but we'll let you go. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good time.
Okay. Now, I just want to stop this and